Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy, where I'm joined by Dr. Garima Mohan, a senior fellow with the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund. The German Marshall Fund is a non-partisan public policy think tank based in the United States with offices across Europe. Today, she joins us from Brussels. Dr. Mohan, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be with you.
So Dr. Garima is a seasoned foreign policy analyst with over a decade of experience examining India's foreign policy and its relationship with Europe. So at a time when India and the EU are accelerating discussions on a free trade agreement, on the Trade and Technology Council, and also the recent visit by the European Commission to Delhi, I think this is a ripe moment to discuss where the India-EU partnership stands today and where it might be headed in the future. So to start things off, I'll begin with my first question. And it's obviously related to what just happened between India and Pakistan. So, Dr. Garima, how did the EU perceive the recent Indo-Pak escalation? Was there a sense of concern, nervousness, given two nuclear powers were engaging in this sort of escalation? Was there a willingness to intervene if the situation worsened? So, what were the views there?
So obviously, the EU and the member states were watching with great concern what was happening between India and Pakistan. If you look at the statements that have come out of both the EU and various countries in Europe, there was a clear criticism of the terrorist attack on Pahalgaon, that this was regrettable, and the loss of civilian life was obviously considered a huge issue. There was generally sort of no criticism of India or Indian strikes, and it was understood that India had to respond, that this was, coming. I think this was expected. However, we did see some statements that spoke of restraints on both sides, particularly the statement by the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, where she, released a tweet where she said she spoke to both sides, India and Pakistan, and both sides need to exercise restraint. This obviously did not go well. And after that, we saw those statements change back into what was the position of the EU generally, that the terrorist attack was regrettable, and India had a right to respond. And so this was generally the response, because it was an evolving situation. We were seeing things escalate day by day. So obviously there was a lot of concern. But because it was an ongoing situation, people were also sort of waiting to see how things fall. There was so much disinformation online. So I think generally people were waiting to see. On the question of intervening, I think it was pretty clear on the European side, at least, that there was no desire for intervention of any sort, particularly from India. I think we did see some evidence of the EU coordinating with the UK that was playing a role, along with the US and the Saudis and the Emiratis, in sort of diffusing the conflict. But otherwise, we didn't see any major pushes from the EU on this.
Right. It's important what you said, right? That overall there was an acceptance of the fact that India has the right to respond and can respond with force. Obviously, as you mentioned, the official statements called for exercising restraint. But it's interesting because the view of the EU is not so highlighted, at least in the Indian media. And as you mentioned, the US. So coming to my next question, given the US's role in somewhat mediating the crisis, at least temporarily, in bringing a ceasefire. Um, I was wondering, with the recent news of Zelensky going to Turkey to meet Putin, which of course as of today has not happened. He has sent I think, a team with his defense minister, and obviously there's no sign of either Putin or Trump. Keeping this in the background, what is Europe's assessment of the reliability or the direction of US leadership in the Ukraine war?
I think zooming out of Ukraine, if we look at the state of the transatlantic alliance today between US and its oldest allies in Europe, there is a clear understanding in Europe that there has been a fundamental break in this alliance with the election of President Trump. The first term of President Trump was seen by many in Europe as a one-off thing, and the re-election or the election of President Biden and the Democrats coming back into the White House was staunch supporters of the transatlantic alliance. It was seen as a return to sort of normalcy in the good old days, and this is where there was a fundamental mistake made by many in Europe in thinking that this was a one-off thing. And now with the second Trump administration, it is very clear to Europe that there has been a fundamental break in this alliance, and there need to be new European conversations on how Europe takes care of its own security, particularly Ukraine, where the US position now under President Trump is much more sympathetic to Russia. And Europeans have sort of, even Ukrainians to an extent, had been left out of the conversation about ceasefire and reaching a potential peace in Ukraine. So there is a new seriousness with which Europe is thinking of its security and investing in its security. It's also thinking about China policy differently, and generally its engagement in the world and European foreign policy. It's been understood that it has to, dually de-risk from China on the one hand, and also de-risk in certain areas from the US, which is where we also see India play a role, and a renewed interest with which Europe, so to say, is pursuing partners like India.
Right. Talking about de-risking, so let's go to trade for a moment. I mean, security will keep coming back to. So, as we know, the India EU FTA free trade agreement has been under negotiation for a while now. I think after 2007. So, it's been more than a decade. And with the recent signing of the UK India FTA agreement, do you see an expediting of the EU's willingness to close the deal with India? And do you think there is also then greater room for flexibility or concessions from the EU side?
Yes, so I think definitely the EU-India FTA is a top priority right now for the EU and India both. When President von der Leyen visited New Delhi, both her and Prime Minister Modi announced in the joint press conference that there is an end of year deadline to conclude this FTA, which just shows a tremendous amount of political will that is behind these negotiations now. Having spoken to officials both on the European and the Indian side, they talk about reaching a deal by the end of this year looking increasingly likely, more so than any time it has in the recent past. And you just mentioned how long this FTA process has dragged on for. I think from the Indian side as well as the EU side, both are looking for commercially meaningful and mutually beneficial FTA, obviously. So the EU is going to be pragmatic about concessions that need to be made to reach this FTA. For instance, the EU knows that the FTA with India will probably not be as comprehensive as its FTA with, say, New Zealand. However, as I just mentioned, with US tariffs, trade war, declining exports to China, there is an understanding in the EU that it needs to work with partners like India. There's even more an urgency. So there's definitely understanding of making concessions from the EU side. Similarly, for India, I think India also realizes that it needs to insulate against this tariffized world we live in. With President Trump now talking of reshoring and talking of Apple moving manufacturing from India back to the US, I think it is also very important for India to look for new economic partnerships, which explains why we saw the India-UK FTA conclude. Keir Starmer, Prime Minister Starmer, said that this is the best deal, the biggest deal the UK has achieved since Brexit, and the best deal India has ever agreed to. So I think it's a huge step and also shows willingness from the Indian side to conclude an FTA. So overall, things are looking good for the end of year deadline for the EU-India one.
Right. Just building on that, so which sectors or regulatory issues do you think will be the most critical in either breaking or advancing the final stages of the FTA talks?
See, there are so many different sectors and there are different issues that come up. For example, agriculture is a sensitive sector for both India as well as the EU. But I think zooming out a little bit, we need to see that number one, there needs to be a sustainability chapter in this FTA. Um, so that will be something that EU and India need to figure out. Of course, it won't be a quote unquote gold standard in the sustainability chapters that the EU is used to. So that needs to be there for any such deal to go through on the EU side. And second, there needs to be a meaningful market access package. If these things are sort of checked off, then issues around individual sectors can be solved. But to me, these are the two make or break issues.
Right, that's very interesting, because I think most of the time the focus is on, as you said, sustainability, but also I think more minute details related to carbon taxation and the credit system, and of
Yeah.
course technology as well. Given we have sort of diverging, at least domestic policies on data, on privacy, and emerging technologies. So that was
Mm.
interesting. Now, just sort of zooming in to Germany, since you've extensively worked on India Germany relations, we just saw the election of Merz as chancellor, which was a bit dramatic, losing in the first round and then finally winning in the second round. So, how do you think this leadership transition from Scholz to Merz will influence Germany's foreign policy priorities, obviously, in particular concerning India?
Yes, you're absolutely right. There was so much drama around this elections. It's been a very interesting period to watch, at least for observers of Germany. So I think there's a clear difference between Chancellor Scholz and Chancellor Merz, particularly because Merz is styling himself to be the foreign policy chancellor. He will be more decisive on some of these issues. Because of the removal of the debt brake, there will be more German spending on defense. He has also talked more about de-risking from China. And he has obviously spoken also about the state of the transatlantic relationship. Generally, we see how the government is being structured. The foreign ministry is with his party, so we will see less inter-coalition fighting, even though this is a grand coalition government as well. We'll probably see less of foreign policy tussle between the chancellery and the foreign ministry than we saw under the Scholz government. So I think all the signs point to greater investment in foreign policy, which is an existential issue for Europe at this point. And we are hoping that Chancellor Merz really builds on the focus on India paper the previous government adopted. There seems to be and a cross-party consensus on the importance of India and Germany as well. So we'll really have to see how this plays out. It was interesting to see India being mentioned in the coalition agreement that all the partners had agreed to, as well as some very critical language of China. And as I've written in the past, a lot of the China debate is what is driving sort of rediscovery of India as an important partner in Europe. So hopefully we'll see more investment in the India relationship as well.
Right. Talking about China, that's a great place to start the next question, which is, and since both of us sort of work in our respective think tanks in the Indo Pacific programs, I thought it's interesting that it's been 4 years since the EU launched its Indo Pacific strategy, and almost 5 years since Germany outlined its own Indo Pacific strategy. Of course, we have France, the UK with their respective guidelines. But how do you see the EU and Germany's Indo-Pacific strategy, having evolved? Like, was there on terms of implementation or sort of policy coherence? How do you see the last few years?
See, the biggest achievement of the Indo Pacific policies and guidelines, both on the EU side as well as on the German side, has been that this idea of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific being integrated theaters, this region being extremely important, the center of dynamism for economic prosperity for Europe, also the theater facing the most pressing security challenges, which will have an impact on Europe. The fact that these ideas have been mainstreamed in policy making, I think for me, this is the biggest achievement, more so than any number of frigates sent to the Indo Pacific. I think it is the most important is to see that this idea is now has been streamlined. And the biggest evidence of that has been how both the EU and Germany have engaged with India and redoubled on putting more resources towards the India partnership, because the central idea of the Indo-Pacific concept is that India is a key pillar in maintaining a multipolar Asia, right? A multipolar Indo-Pacific. And this for me has been the biggest shift. One, streamlining of the idea across policy making. Two, investments in India. And third, we've also seen, the German Navy send frigates more regularly to the Indo-Pacific, doing joint exercises with partners in the region. The EU having an integrated sort of a comprehensive maritime instrument for the Indian Ocean. Obviously, the war in Ukraine has also diverted some of the attention to this military security challenges on the European continent are more pressing, but this hasn't taken away from the general importance of the region, and also understanding how many of the China-related challenges in the Indo-Pacific are being replicated in Europe, whether it be on critical infrastructure, generally the need to de-risk China's increasing economic, political, security footprint, all of those things. So I think in general, that is how I see the success of the Indo-Pacific strategies.
Yes, I agree with you that one of the biggest sort of achievements is just the recognition of the Indo Pacific being a very important theater. And as you mentioned, it's not only about the number of frigates or sort of visits by naval ships, but I think having a strategy like this has also allowed a lot of private sector focus. To this region, which of course I think underpins a lot of the partnership. So moving on again to something similar, and this is something that President von der Leyen said during her visit in Delhi, right? She said this in an era of great power competition, this is an opportune moment to reimagine the EU-India partnership. And in a 2021 article also, you'd argued that India must not underestimate the EU as a partner. And that led me to think, has the EU somewhere, you think, historically underestimated India's potential as a partner, and have focused too much on, say, its transatlantic partners or China?
Yes, absolutely. That is correct. Historically, the EU has not focused on India as much as it should have. I'm working on an article actually on the evolution of European Asia policy through post Cold War. And it's been very interesting to see, like 1994, 96, there was a European Asia strategy. 2016, there was a Asia strategy, which all focus on China. And at the most, the dynamic economies of Southeast Asia and ASEAN. So it was China that was the dominant dominating lens through which Europe saw Asia. It also had an impact when we look at Germany, for instance, and Chancellor Merkel's policies, which double down on economic engagement with China. That Germany was often the pace setter of European Asia policy. And so we really saw this investment, wholehearted investment in the China relationship to the detriment of other partners, particularly of India. But now we've obviously seen that being corrected and at great speed. So the end of the Merkel era has also meant the end of this sort of naive sort of China policy that was only looking at the commercial angle. And now European conversations on China and the Indo-Pacific have become much more mature, circumspect, looking at the interlinked political, economic, security challenges coming from China, and then doubling down on India. It is really crucial to note that the February visit of the EU Commission to India was historic. Never before have we seen the entire College of Commissioners, 22, come to a country along with the Commission President. And that really shows how Europe is now doubling down on partners like India and has understood the mistakes of historically only focusing on one country. And what you mentioned in the era of great power competition, I really like the quote by President von der Leyen, where she said that in the era of great power competition, the interests of EU and India align. So for the first time, we are moving away from this rather amorphous talk of we are both democratic partners with great with almost a federal system, etc., which is all good, but there was never really a definition of interests in areas where India and Europe converge. And so with this visit, I've seen the sharpest articulation of that come from the European side, at least.
Right. You're absolutely right. And I think that puts into perspective a lot of what we're seeing. And I think India also needs to start sort of give Europe its due importance. And sort of leaping on that, recently, our External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, he recently said in a summit that India needs partners, not preachers, and he said that in the context of the EU. So I want to know, why do you think India often perceives the EU, as a normative sort of player, and whose positioning is either moralizing or intrusive? Does India consider EU a hypocrite, or is that not the case?
I think India perceives the EU often as moralizing because that has been how the EU has interacted or acted as in foreign policy for a long time. This particular statement of External Affairs Minister Jaishankar came in the context that I'd mentioned at the top of this podcast, the statement on the India-Pakistan escalation, which sort of indulged in both sidesism, that both sides need to act with restraint. And that, I think that really shows how far the EU still has to go in developing India capacities, in understanding what are the red lines of a partner like India. And this goes both ways. I think India and Europe both need to urgently and critically invest in building capacities on each other. There needs to be just so much more investment in India in Europe, like we've seen. Think tanks, research institutions, business institutions focusing so much on China. Here in Europe, we need a similar focus on India so that some of these faux pas can be avoided. There's a better understanding of what are the red lines. How do you manage differences in this relationship better? We also saw this come to fore with India's position on Ukraine and India's relationship with Russia, where Europeans did not understand the history of India's relationship with Russia. And India, on the other hand, I think underestimated how much of a challenge the Russian invasion of Ukraine was existentially for Europe. So that, I think, could be a difficult issue that needs to be managed and can only be solved if we build capacities on India in Europe and vice versa.
Right. That's a very important point. So as we look ahead in the next decade, obviously, as you mentioned, the FTA is something that we see as happening at least in the short term. But you also warn against the fact that naming the FTA as a primary deliverable of this partnership is a risky move because we know how difficult it is to completely sign a comprehensive FTA, especially with such a large partner. So given that, what institutional or structural shifts would you like to see that you think can anchor the India EU partnership more firmly?
That's a really good question. I think one of the reasons why I say the FTA should not be the only deliverable is that we are living in a world where free trade is increasingly under pressure, and countries are moving towards being a bit more inward looking, protectionist. Everybody wants to, talk about their country first strategies. And I think in this environment, it is more important to align industrial policy, for instance, to ensure that both European and Indian industry remains competitive, to compare notes of how we will both be impacted by the incoming China shock, where because of overcapacities, our markets will be flooded by Chinese goods. What does that mean for the competitiveness of our industry? We need to start talking about strategic technologies, AI, quantum. Where do we, have convergences here? How can we improve not just government to government, but also private sector cooperation in these critical areas, particularly in sectors where the EU wants to de risk and India wants to move up the supply chain, be it green energy, solar cells, wind, but also semiconductors, electronics, which are important areas for India. So I think it's very important for Europe and India to build several pillars of cooperation. FTA is one, an important one. The second more important pillar for me is economic security, where we can talk not just about de risking from China, but also managing a rather unpredictable United States and what that means for both of us as partners. And third, obviously, is security and defense. Europe is getting more interested in playing a key role in its own security. We see initiatives like Rearm Europe, where member states are talking about investing in manufacturing defense equipment at home, keeping defense supply chains secure. What does that mean for India and Make in India and defense manufacturing in India? I mean, after this crisis with Pakistan, I think one key lesson that New Delhi will take is on investing in military capacities and defense. So here too, we are both facing somewhat similar pressures, and it would be very important to align and see what are the areas of convergences. So I think we need to create these solid fundamental pillars of cooperation, which also means that if one pillar is not working well, the other two are still strong enough to sustain the partnership.
Right. Yes. I think that's very important. While being dependent on each other, they should also have the independent strength to withstand the partnership. And you mentioned security and defense ties as being crucial. It's very interesting that after Germany recently removed sort of its constitutional debt break obligations, especially on defense and infrastructure spending, the stocks of some Indian defense companies went right up.
Mm.
So I think there is even, I think, stronger private sector and investor confidence
Mm.
in this area between the EU and India. And of course, another sort of widely discussed idea in the media is the India Middle East corridor, which, as you've also written that while it is an important connectivity project, we haven't really seen any big development on that front, because a lot of that hinges on the Middle East, which itself is an increasingly unstable region. Yes, we agree with a lot of the points that you made today. And it's, as you said, it's good to see that issues like trade, technology, economic security are being discussed in the India EU partnership, and not just the fact that, yes, we're two democracies who propagate similar values, because we need more than that to build a relationship. Yes, any other concluding thoughts, Dr. Mohan?
No, I think this has been quite a comprehensive conversation. As always, my message is what I have mentioned before: capacity building in India and Europe, and in vice versa. I think that is really important to sustain any government to government or business to business momentum, is when you sort of build this broader understanding in societies of each other. The US India relationship has very much benefited from it, also with the people to people connect. And I hope we can see those developments on the Europe front. But this has been a very interesting conversation, and all I can say is thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohan, and thank you so much to our listeners.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.